Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this situational briefing by the MirYam Institute on the recent announcement of the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I appreciate, as ever, all of you for giving your time and attention to a subject that warrants that time and that attention. And I also want to express my profound thanks to my colleagues at the MirYam Institute for bringing this about. And we have two experts from the MirYam Institute who are here to weigh in on rather a heady topic. First, we have Professor Chuck Freilich, who serves as an adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University, as well as at Tel Aviv University. Chuck is a former deputy national security advisor in Israel and a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and has taught political science at Harvard, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. He's also the author of several books: Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy; Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change; and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. He's published numerous academic articles and over 200 op-eds, and he appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. He's also the host of the MirYam Institute's IDDF podcast. That's Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, which you can download for free wherever you download your podcasts from. I strongly recommend that you subscribe to that program. That's the IDDF podcast, which he hosts and regularly converses with Israel's former ambassador to the United States of America, Ambassador Danny Ayalon. For the purpose of this conversation, Chuck is going to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Yochai Guiski, a retired officer of the Israel Defense Forces who served there for 23 years. He retired in 2020 as Lieutenant Colonel after serving in the Israeli military intelligence. And Yochai served in various roles, including the coordination of government activities in the territories, also known as Kogat, the Strategic Planning Division, and the Ministry of Defense Politico-Military Directorate. And Yochai Guiski agrees with almost absolutely nothing that I say or write about at the MirYam Institute, but we love the back and forth, and I always learn from him. So, gents, it's wonderful to have you both here. I'm going to fire some questions out. I just want everybody to know the point at which we start. Riyadh and Tehran announced this past Friday that after several years of severed ties, they would reopen embassies and missions within 2 months and implement security and economic cooperation agreements signed more than 20 years ago. So, Chuck, I'd like you to give us the context of the ties that were severed between the Iranians and the Saudis. I'd like you to tell us what precipitated the severance of those ties. And also, I'd like you to tell us about the security and economic cooperation agreements that were signed some 2 decades ago. Chuck, it's over to you if you would weigh in a little bit on that.
First of all, we're talking about two countries that have been antagonistic to each other for decades. One is the leader of the Sunni world, Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the holy places, the center of the entire Islamic world, and the other is the leader of the Shiite world, Iran. There are also two leading powers in the Middle East, certainly two leading powers in the Gulf region. So I think we could say that there would be natural reasons for a rivalry between them had we not had the Sunni Shia schism in the background. And one is a radical theocracy, or radical, both I would say domestically and internationally, externally, and the other, Saudi Arabia, is very, very cautious, usually in its foreign affairs. Yemen was the one big exception to the rule. But domestically is also, at least it was a radical theocracy, and is today undergoing truly dramatic changes. Now, the relations were severed 7 years ago. The specific context was the Saudis executed a leading Shiite cleric, and the Iranians responded by severing diplomatic ties, and lots of other things came to a halt as a consequence. The two countries had in the past signed deep cooperation agreements, both in the military and economic areas. these agreements were never fully fulfilled. And I think, just as a word of caution as we begin the discussion, it's worth waiting to see what actually comes of this, because it will not be the first time, maybe in the world and generally, certainly among the states in our region, ostensibly sign agreements, major breakthroughs, and they don't actually happen. So let's wait and see from that point of view.
So thank you, Chuck. Yochai, I want to turn now to something stated by our Prime Minister here in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu. He expressed very, very explicitly that a central plank of his return to the office of Prime Minister was to widen the circle of peace, specifically by adding Saudi Arabia to the list of signatories to the Abraham Accords. Now, that goal was predicated upon the mooted Saudi desire to be a part of an alliance of nations against Iran's nuclear ambitions. Now, Yochai, Major General Giora Eiland, who, as you know, is the former head of the Israeli National Security Council, he stated that the Saudis were never realistically to be expected to leap aboard the Abraham Accords. Can you tell us what makes Saudi Arabia so different to the signatories to the Accords? And does this dash Netanyahu's hopes of bringing them aboard? After all, there's nothing that strictly prevents the Saudis from normalizing ties with the Iranians and normalizing ties with Israel, is there?
No, there's not something that's preventing that thing from happening, but the Saudis' expectations of the U.S. of giving them things that the U.S. is unwilling to give them. The Saudis are expecting something like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow with regards to nuclear capabilities, civilian nuclear capabilities without conditions, and other gifts and from the U.S. which are unfounded. I'm afraid. So if the Saudis are looking for the pie in the sky, then it will be harder. It will be much harder to get there. If the Saudis will become more realist regarding what they can get from the U.S., what they can get from a partnership with Israel, then the fact that they have opened embassies in Tehran will not prevent that. They're not going to become comrades. They're not going to follow each other's and hug each other there. The Iranians and the Saudis are long enemies and rivals. They know each other. This is not going to end or disappear because someone just signed a piece of paper about getting embassies together on both sides. And as Chuck said, we have to wait and see, even if that would come about. So we have to look into this, because in my opinion here, the Iranians didn't get much, at least from the Saudis. The Saudis are expecting something to happen in Yemen, and the Chinese got a symbolic win here. But the major thing here is that the Chinese are now involved in this, and so they need to gain something. They need to show that they can bring something about, and not have a failed agreement on their hands. So it'll be very interesting to see how China evolves into that role, which a long time we've been looking to China to assume that, and they haven't.
Okay, so we'll come to China in due course, Yochai, but you mentioned that Saudi expectations of the United States were pie in the sky and not within the bounds of reality. What would be some expectations that are within the bounds of reality? That's question number one for you, Yochai. And question number two, your description here of the shallowness, if I can put it like that, of this détente, that seems to place you in the camp of folks who believe this is a power play on the part of the Saudis to let the Americans know that if they're not willing to play ball, the Saudis have other folks to do that with. Is that your view of this?
It's certainly something like that. They went to the Chinese right after the big summit with Xi Jinping, the 3 summits in Saudi Arabia, which were a completely different contrast to what happened with Joe Biden there. So they're going out of their way to get the Chinese on board. There was now information in the media about a huge deal about making electric cars, Chinese electric cars in Saudi Arabia, to the extent of $100 billion even of investment. So these are huge investments and a huge way to lure China into the camp of Saudi Arabia. I believe this is a good thing, because if China and Iran would have been left there to gain momentum with their relationship without someone else to balance them out, I believe that will be a much worse situation than what we have right now. And the Iranians were working at it. Raisi went to Beijing specifically to try and restart those relationships, the economic ties between them. Now, regarding your first question, I believe that if the Saudis are willing to work with the Americans on security, getting a peaceful nuclear plan, which a verifiable one, like the UAE, and balance what they do with the Chinese and the Russians, I believe that they have things to gain with the U.S. But I believe that the Saudis are now on a quest to gain their own status as a regional powerhouse, and even be beyond the region. So I'm not sure that they will try and get something modest and gettable out of that deal. They're trying for something bigger. They're trying to catch a bigger fish. I don't know if they can get it. I think they can.
So, Chuck, as I said at the beginning, this reconciliation seems to be focused on the reopening of embassies in each country, the renewal of trade relations, and the prevention of attacks and security threats in each country, presumably somewhat from each country towards each country, given the history of these two states. You made a very important note of caution at the outset during your first answer. Look, there remain massive ideological disputes between the two countries, significant hegemonic ambitions, most notably from Iran and the ongoing threat of Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. In what areas do the implications of this normalization go beyond what has been announced? And in what areas does what has been announced go well beyond what actually will be? These countries are not friends, and they're not natural bedfellows.
Well, I agree completely with your conclusion. And I mean, it's hard to speculate here because we don't know. Maybe very little will come out of this, and I won't be surprised if that's the case. On the other hand, I think we have to understand, Yochai presented, I believe, one part of the picture, which is what he called Saudi pie-in-the-sky expectations. That may be the case. But the Saudis also have, and I just want to present their position now. I don't want to justify it, but one has to understand where they're coming from as well. They've got a long litany of complaints towards the US that start maybe with the Second Gulf War, which they thought, they didn't think Saddam should be toppled. They were afraid that Iraq would come apart, and they were afraid that Iran would become the winner of this whole thing, and that fear may have been borne out. They believe that the U.S. simply abandoned Mubarak when the Arab Spring broke out. Egypt was defined as the number one Arab ally in the Middle East, and the U.S. turned its back on him. And of course, their fear was, well, if you, the U.S., can abandon your number one Arab ally, you can abandon us. Then in 2019, the Iranians launched a major attack against Saudi oil facilities, and even Trump, the big talker, doesn't respond. They believe that the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, was a historic error. They, of course, from their point of view, understandably, do not like, let's say, the Obama and the Biden administration's emphasis on human rights issues and the Khashoggi affair. And they also believe that the U.S. came to the conclusion that it no longer needs Saudi oil, which may be true, but the U.S. seems to have forgotten the fact that there's an international oil market, and maybe the U.S. doesn't need Saudi oil anymore, but the rest of the world sure does, and it's one big market. So they have, as a result of these considerations and others, they've come to doubt the American commitment to Saudi security. Right? There was a decades-long unspoken or unwritten, I should say, deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. provides security, the Saudis provide oil at a semi-decent price. And they're not sure that that commitment is there anymore. And so they're hedging their bets. They're trying to put eggs in different baskets. Now it's the Chinese basket. They've been flirting with the Russians in recent years. The reason that we had and hopefully we'll still have the potential for a breakthrough with Israel, the reason that there was this talk, not all of it justified, of a Sunni Israeli axis against Iran, wasn't because the Saudis became ardent Zionists. They didn't. It was because they were afraid of Iran and because they weren't sure of the American commitment, and they turned to us in partial, almost desperation. And now what they see is that actually, they never thought that Israel could replace the United States, but even the partial replacement that they saw in us seems to be coming apart at the seams in a totally self-inflicted crisis. 2 months ago, Israel was booming economically. It was a stable, vibrant democracy. And today people are deeply worried about both of these things. And the conclusion is, well, if we can't count on the Americans, we can't count on the Israelis, we better find somebody else to ensure at least help us with our security, or at least reduce the potential dangers. And I think what they're trying to do here, and if this goes ahead, they're trying to reduce the dangers. They're not going to become friends with the Iranians, but they're trying to reduce the dangers.
And I should mention, Chuck, you correctly said that they were against the idea of Donald Trump's administration withdrawing from the JCPOA, but they were also against Barack Obama ratifying the JCPOA and brokering the JCPOA. And I think there's plenty of blame to go on both sides, right?
Like I said, I'm not trying to justify them. I just think
yes, and
I want to understand where the actors come from.
Yeah, I actually want to mention something because I always get a little bit of blowback when you write and speak, and it's one of the reasons that I'm so determined to keep you writing and speaking. What I think a lot of people don't realize about your area of expertise, Chuck, is that part of it entails you placing yourself in the shoes of the people we're trying to figure out, right? And putting forward their interests and assessing their interests and understanding how Israel should respond to those, right? When you were a deputy national security advisor. So I want everyone to understand that is the really unique and insightful aspect that you bring to all of these. And I think that your view there with regard to the Saudis is very much appreciated, and how they look at the United States of America. But into the void has stepped China. Now, I'm going to stick with you, Chuck, for just a moment. China does not have nothing close to the presence that the United States has here in Israel and the broader Middle East. But its interests here are, I wouldn't say clearly stated, but they're stated and they're rising, and they've caused considerable challenges for Israel's relationship with the United States in recent years. Nothing too dramatic, but the challenges are there nonetheless. Tell us what you think China sees itself extracting from its role as broker here between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and what are the implications for Israel?
China imports vast quantities of oil, both from Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they want to be the world's leading economic power. And at a later stage, a couple of decades from now, they want to be the world's leading global power generally. To that end, they need a stable, hopefully peaceful Middle East. And I think that they believe that they've achieved a couple of things here, or three things. One is they've ensured, maybe that's too strong a word, they've increased the likelihood of a stable flow of energy sources. They've reduced the threat to their interests in the region. And they won around, they came up ahead of the US in a region which has been led by the US for decades. Now, this isn't the end of the American presence in the region by any means. The US has been slowly withdrawing in recent years. Well, it's not so recent. It actually started under Bush too, and it's continued under a number of presidents consecutively since then. The US is still the major military power in the region, but the US doesn't want to get involved militarily. And if the competition is mostly economic and diplomatic, well, then China brings its advantages to that because it's got this huge economic clout for obvious reasons because of its size as an economy. And diplomatically, they can speak to both the Saudis and the Iranians, whereas the Americans are limited mostly to the Saudi side. And yes, some quiet indirect negotiations with the Iranians on the nuclear issue, but they can't negotiate between the two sides. And I think there's a question that we should ask ourselves. I don't know the answer to this, but if for decades we've been waiting for the Chinese moment in the Middle East, and until now China has really just been an economic player in the region, is this the beginning of the Chinese era in the Middle East? Not completely at the expense of the United States, but partly so.
So I'm actually going to ask you, Yochai, to come back on that. Chuck's raised an important question there. Are we seeing the genesis of the Chinese era in the Middle East? Given all of the caveats that he stated, do you think that we're now going to see the Chinese become, if not the 800-pound gorilla, then maybe the 300 or 600-pound gorilla here in our region?
I believe that's already the case. National security is not always and not only about military power or security. It's about economics. It's about how you control your own population. And the Middle East is not a democratic area. Mm-hmm. They don't gravitate to what the US is offering, at least at the higher level. And we've seen that in Saudi Arabia and what happened between Saudi Arabia and the United States, what is happening with Turkey, what is happening all over the Middle East. The Chinese model now presents something that is far, far more appealing to everyone in the Middle East. You get a big economic upside. You get someone that knows how to provide you with assets and knowledge and capabilities to monitor your own population, which is a huge, huge upside to places such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all the players in the Middle East. So when they're looking at that, they're saying, hey, China is something that I maybe want to be like, while the US brings along many, many more challenges to how they want to be and how they want to behave. And if you look into the future, just look 10 years into the future. According to what most Western power, the Western and the world has agreed regarding global warming, they're going to cut carbon emissions by 50% if they get there. Now that's going to put the Saudis. They're not going to get their oil to Europe or the US. So that makes China and India the biggest consumers and the ones that will provide them with economic security. So if we're looking at what security is, economic security, and that's the main thing in those places. How do you control the population? How do you provide for them? How do you prevent any challenges to how you rule that area? So having someone that provides a long-term economic benefits and maybe even the system of how to monitor populations, which the U.S. is not. Of course, we don't want that. We want free societies, but it's very appealing to what's going on in Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the question is whether China will release those capabilities to those countries. We'll have to wait and see if China becomes something more than just that. But even that is more than enough.
Now, Chuck, I want to come back to you. Look, I don't know if you know this about me or not, but I am a minority voice on the Abraham Accords, and I acknowledge as much, because quite simply, I don't place a great deal of trust in their durability, and the very limited trust that I do assign to the Accords is trust that must be verified regularly and often. And I don't trust them for any number of reasons, Chuck, but those reasons include the fickle nature of the interests that has bound these signatories together, namely the common desire to block Iran from gaining nuclear weapons capability. To date, Iran possesses no such capability, but they are closing in on that. And I do not accept, and please feel free to disagree with any aspect of what I say here, I do not accept that Israel has the political will to launch a kinetic strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. The Accords, the Abraham Accords, that is, those are going to be stress tested by events taking place in Judea and Samaria and future conflicts in the Gaza Strip. And another round against Hezbollah could further test the Accords, particularly if the IDF is forced to retaliate against Lebanese targets beyond Hezbollah targets, as we have stated our need and readiness to do. Now, Chuck, in my estimation, we're already seeing a cooling of the relations between the signatories of the Accords and Israel. Bibi has not traveled to Abu Dhabi, and the Negev summit has been postponed. If I can see these areas of concern, then I'm sure that the Saudis can see those areas of concern. So here's my question. Has Israel lost its dependability in the eyes of the Saudis? And is this rapprochement the result of that loss of face?
Look, first of all, interests are fleeting. That's the nature of international affairs. And those who wish a guarantee of long-term durability are always destined to be disappointed. The question is how you build up a web of interests that will hopefully lead to greater longevity of the meeting of interests. Look, let's look at world history. Okay. There have been endless conflicts and wars between countries. There's usually a peace, except in the Middle East, there's a peace after the wars, and then there's another peace, another war, and life goes on. So we're never going to achieve perfect security, and it's unlikely that we will achieve various diplomatic agreements that will last forever. Look, we're not a silent partner to this whole thing. What we do is critical to this network of relations. And I agree with you, the primary factor motivating this was the common fear of Iran. That was true, I believe, of Bahrain. That's true partly of the Saudi, or largely of the Saudis. The Emiratis and the Moroccans went beyond that, especially the Emiratis. They embraced Israel in the warmest, most open-hearted way imaginable. I don't know about you, but I was flabbergasted by the warmth of the embrace. And yes, I think it's cool. And as a matter of fact, just I believe it was yesterday, there were press reports that the Emiratis had even canceled some already agreed military sales. I think this is what I was saying before. Certainly the Saudis, and I think the Emiratis, are no longer confident that Israel is a reliable, stable partner for them. And to the extent that it could be a very partial replacement for the United States, because we can never replace the US, but we could be a local replacement, a regional partner replacement. They're not sure of that. When I said before, it looks like Israel's coming apart. We're talking about a situation in which the most courageous fighters in the IDF, pilots, special forces, the people in the elite intelligence units are threatening not to show up. Now, between you and me and all the people watching this, if there's an emergency, they'll all show up. But the very fact that they're threatening not to do so, that hundreds of thousands of people are turning out in the streets for 10 weeks now, weekly, sometimes twice weekly, the Israeli economy is taking a nosedive. We don't look like a stable democracy anymore. You can agree or disagree with what's really happening. If the reforms are good, not good. We don't look good today. We look very, very bad. And this agreement or this potential rapprochement between the Saudis and Iranians, it's not a terrible development from an American perspective, but I also don't think it's the finest moment of American diplomacy in the region in recent decades. The fact is, it was the Chinese, the number one American adversary today, who led this to this breakthrough. It doesn't matter if they came in at the last minute. They got credit for brokering it, and it does increase their influence in the region, which has been increasing in any event. And as you were saying before, it's also led to some tension between us and the US over the relationship with China. So I don't think this is a good development from our point of view. I think the chances of normalization are at very best reduced and postponed. I think the chances of forming this Israeli-Sunni alliance, which would have gone way beyond just the incredible importance vis-a-vis Iran, it would have been a historic transformation in the history of the Middle East, of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Again, at best put off, I hope not worse. And I think this is another indication of the, I would say, almost utter failure of Israel's strategy for countering Iran. Withdrawing from the JCPOA led to a situation where instead of Iran being a year away from a first bomb, today they have enough fissile material for 4 or 5 already today. And the big victors from this rapprochement are the Iranians, because they've reduced a primary source of friction.
Yeah, just before I ask you, Yochai, to weigh in on that, I just want to get something off my chest in response to what Chuck mentioned. Chuck didn't proffer an opinion on the actions of the reservists who have petitioned and said that they won't answer the call for duty. I just want to state that I personally think that this repeated declaration of units and officers and so on and so forth, that they will not arrive for reserve duty, I think it's a disgrace beyond words. I think it's absolutely reprehensible, completely inappropriate. If they wish to avoid undertaking reserve duty as individuals, let them put their names forward as individuals. But to use the tag and the brand of their units as they do so, I think is a dreadful error of judgment. And of course, there are many people who think like me, and there are many reservists who don't demonstrate that they will turn up to reserve duty. They simply will turn up to reserve duty. And I myself, Chuck, and again, I'm emphasizing you didn't proffer an opinion on this, so I'm not saying that you did so, but I myself completely disagreed with Israel's policy with regard to the Gaza Strip. I still answered the call every time that I was called. I still arrived from overseas. Never would I have considered doing anything other than that, and never would I have considered threatening to do anything other than that. And I think that they bear some dreadful and heavy responsibility in terms of how Israel appears today. But I do appreciate you bringing that point forward.
So let me just weigh in, if I can, quickly, to confirm the opinion that I didn't.
Yeah.
Look, I think that we should leave the IDF out of the political debates. And so from that point of view, I do think this is a mistake and it should stop. I also think that we have to understand the depth of the dismay that people feel, that people like these reservists can come out with the statements that they've made, and they believe that they're serving the higher cause, the higher good of saving Israel from itself here. Let me leave it at that.
No, I agree with you. I think that's fair, and I understand it. I think it's dreadfully misguided. I think that it's a mistake, and also I just go one step further, is that I think it's actually a disgrace. I think it's a total disgrace. I don't think there's justification for it, and I think there has to be a point beyond which we do not inject our personal political views into the higher imperatives of security for the states of Israel, and to take, as I say, the brand and the badge of the units and to assign those to directly a political debate to essentially put forward their opposition on headed note paper, if I can put it like that, I think that that will be recorded as a dreadful, dreadful hinge in terms of public discourse here in the States of Israel. But in any event, I appreciate your view, Chuck, and you're right to draw to the attention of people on this webinar the dismay, because the dismay is real. You can feel it here. I feel it here. And it's not going to go away, frankly, until this issue goes away. And who knows when that will be. But let's not digress too much. What I would like to know is, Yochai, do you agree with Chuck's assessment that, A, this is not a catastrophic failure on the part of US foreign policy, or do you think that actually this does have severe implications for the United States and for its dependability here in the region?
I'll answer that in two ways. One, the U.S. has long sought to get something to extract the Saudis out of the quagmire that they have self-inflicted upon themselves in Yemen. So anything with regards to how the U.S. sees this that extracts or helps the Saudis get out of that problem, which has exacerbated everything between the U.S. and the Saudis, between how the Saudis feel about how the U.S. is protecting them, and provided the Iranians with a huge platform for gaining operational knowledge, a foothold, influence in the region. So if that could be dialed down, it will be an achievement that the U.S. would like to see, even if that was brokered by someone like China. In the past, the Russians got involved, and the U.S. was all right with that. In the distant past, not in the past 2 years. So I don't think that will be. If that would come about, I think the United States would see it as a victory to their strategic goals and how they see the region stabilizing. The second thing, so the question is, and what we know from the U.S. side is that the Saudis kept them in the loop the whole time. So the U.S. was, at least the current administration saw it as something that is worthwhile if it came about. So I don't think this is something that would diminish how the U.S. standing is. There are a lot of other things that Chuck has sought to bring about that why the U.S. is not the shining beacon of light to the Middle Eastern, especially with their commitment to the security of their partners. But if we're looking at just this particular agreement, I don't think this is something that would hurt the U.S. On the second thing that we talked about, Iran is Iran. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Iran has practiced destabilizing almost every country in the region. They have destabilized their Syria from within. They're putting their own militias there. They have destabilized Lebanon. They have destabilized Iraq. Every single one of these countries are an economic quagmire, disaster. You pick the thing that you want to say. And even Iran itself. Iran is doing it in Yemen too. So I don't believe that anyone in that is partner to the accords with Israel, to the Abraham Accord, now look at Iran differently, and the Saudis don't look at Iran differently. So the appeal of having someone stand up to the Iranians, stand up for those people in the region, and stand up against the Iranians. This is what Israel has been doing for the past few decades. So it's an appeal that is separate from what the U.S. is bringing about, and without the U.S. interest. And Israel is also looked upon as someone that can influence U.S. interest and U.S. behavior and U.S. policy on that regard. So they are buying into the Mearsheimer agenda of the UN, of the Jewish lobby and the Israeli lobby, and its amazing capabilities of manipulating the United States. We all know that this is untrue, but there is a connection, a very visceral connection between the U.S. and Israel on many levels. That maybe if the Israelis come to the Americans and tell them, look, this is a problem, the Americans are more likely to listen to Israel than they're likely to listen to the Saudis. And if that is the bet that they're betting, it's not an unwise one. So I'm not sure that your take on the Abraham Accord and their stability, so that they're coming apart because of this event. I don't think so. And if Iran were to change itself completely and become a peaceful nation and draw back from how it does business in the region, well, but then our problems will also be solved. So I'm buying into that.
Not for the first time. I don't agree with you, and I'm going to turn this to Chuck. So, and I'll explain where I disagree with you, Yochai, and we'll continue this conversation offline as well, I'm sure. Number one, Iran can change dramatically, though not for the better. If Iran gains nuclear weapons capabilities, that will be a dramatic change, and you could well see the reaction of the countries in our region change in accordance with that new threat. Perhaps they will want to be closer to Iran. Perhaps they'll be more fearful, but perhaps they will be more accommodating, and distancing themselves from the state of Israel would become a possibility. That's number one. Number two, because of what Chuck said earlier in this conversation, I'm going to dig into that a little bit in my next question. I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu currently has the open door to policymakers and the administration in the United States of America. I don't think that he has it in the way that once he did, because of the difficulties that are taking place domestically. I think that he is paying a price. He hasn't had an invitation to the White House. I'm sure it will be forthcoming, but it has not been forthcoming in rapid fashion. And I would like to know, Chuck, if you still feel that the signatories to the Abraham Accords, especially in light of this rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, are they still looking at Israel as the great influencer and the great presence when it comes to establishing America's policy in the Middle East, or helping to hone that policy, if I can put it more precisely, even if it's just at the margins, to rightly pick up on Yochai's well-made point about the conspiracies of Jews running things and so forth, which obviously is not true.
Well, if it isn't true, let's not tell anybody. First of all, I'm glad that there was a note of disagreement in what you were saying, because until now this has been far too harmonious. And I was looking for something to disagree with Yochai on, and I found it happily. I certainly agree with him that in terms of Yemen, this would be, if it really happens, it would be a win from the American perspective. But in terms of containing Iran, it's not a win. In terms of the fact that Iran has now forged an alliance both with Russia and China, it's not a win from that point of view. It's not a win in terms of China's rising influence in the region and in the world. And it's not a win in terms of the axis that the US has been trying to build between Israel and the Sunni states, both vis-a-vis Iran and just for regional normalization, to promote Israel's standing in the region. Look, if Iran goes nuclear, you were saying how will that affect the calculations of the other actors in the region? Well, I think it's not a question of how it's going to affect their behavior in the future. We see it now. One of the reasons for this is the fact that they are scared, they're petrified that Iran will go nuclear, that the United States cannot be counted on to prevent it, and that Israel is not the reliable regional ally that they thought it might be to help counter Iran. I agree with you fully that the prime minister does not today have the open door in Washington that he may have once had. Look, I think that I've thought this, as you know, I think from our conversations, I've thought that the US and Israel are heading to a crisis in any event. It's partly because of changes in American demography unrelated to Israel. It's primarily because of Israel's policies regarding the West Bank and the Palestinian issue generally. It's partly over differences over the Iranian issue, mostly Netanyahu's famous or infamous speech in the Congress and the partisan element that he introduced to US-Israeli relations. And now there's really two big things. One is the rise of a hard right government in Israel, which at least speaks in terms of annexationist terms, which is against a two-state solution, which has been the basis for overcoming differences between the US and Israel on numerous Palestinian-related issues over the decades. But we thought we had a common vision of where we're heading on the Palestinian issue. That's not there anymore. And yes, I think that the Sunni states no longer view Israel as quite the channel to Washington that it was in the past. I think the Israel lobby does not have anything like the kind of influence that it used to have, partly for the various reasons I just mentioned. And also, as you know, because we've agreed on this in the past also, because the splintering of the lobby into different groups, whatever your perspectives, you agree with J Street, you agree with ZOA, whatever, the fact that there are multiple competing, supposedly pro-Israel lobbies in Washington, I think the sum total is weaker than the part.
So I've just got time for a couple more questions, but again, Chuck, you know, there's nothing I love more than having the opportunity to discuss things candidly with the folks here at the MirYam Institute. You said that Netanyahu's speech was either famous to the joint session of Congress or infamous. Just for what my view is worth, one of the proudest moments of my life as a Jew and as a Zionist and as a citizen, etc., is the fact that we had a prime minister who could go and speak with such eloquence and with such tenacity and speak truth to power. And I believe it actually precipitated the Abraham Accords. I think that was a moment where the countries around us looked and said, this is a reliable partner in the region who is willing, able, and ready to voice his disagreement, even in the face of the United States, even in the United States, even in the face of a foreign policy plank of a sitting president of the United States. Really one of the greatest moments of my life as an observer of Israel's unfolding history. But I know that some will disagree with me, and of course they're more than entitled to their viewpoint. I want to ask a quick question, really to both of you to weigh in on, because with very few exceptions, we live in a part of the world that really, and you've alluded to this earlier, but I want to dig down on it a little bit more. We live in a part of the world that really knows almost exclusively permanence of leadership. Israel is one of those exceptions that I alluded to. And we've just here undergone a period of tremendous electoral instability. Now this coalition seems shaky to me. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think it looks a little bit shaky. I'll say something here with a very, very heavy heart, and I want to repeat this to you and to our listeners. I say this with a very heavy heart. Without drawing parallels between the levels of oppression that takes place in Iran, and without drawing parallels between the level of brutality that the Iranian regime launches against its own citizens, if you were an observer from afar, and you really didn't know too much about this region, or perhaps if you did know about this region, but you weren't here on the ground in Israel, and you were watching the turmoil taking place in Israel's streets at this time, the demonstrations and more, one could be forgiven for drawing a visual comparison between the images of chaos, not brutality, but chaos taking place right here, right now, and the images of chaos that we periodically see taking place in the streets of Iran. Now, chaos does not breed confidence. Have our domestic woes, in your opinion, and I'll take this to you first, Yochai, and then Chuck, I want you to weigh in on it as well. Have our domestic woes precipitated this regional and international failure? And let's come to the nub of this. is this development a failure on our part here in Israel? We've spoken a lot about Iran and Saudi Arabia and America and China, but we have agency in this story as well. Is this a failure on our part here in Israel, this rapprochement between these two countries? Yochai, you first, please.
No, I don't think so. I'm really the table has been set for such a long time on these issues, on where China is playing between these two players, on where the Saudis are moving out of the American orbit, and where the stress that has been inflicted on the Iranian economy is growing out of proportion, and what is going on there with the poisoning of school children. It's horrendous what's going on in Iran. So the Iranians were looking for an outlet out of that pressure. The Saudis were looking to get China on board with what they want in the region. So I don't believe that this is our fault in any way. Israel has, and I don't think that this these particular set of events have yet influenced our standing in the region. Mossad is still something that to be reckoned with, and everyone that hears that name knows what it means. And the Israeli Air Force, everyone knows who we are. Still, if things start to be torn apart in Israel, it might influence something. I think this is more to do with Europe, or more to do with other places. There's also glee. There's always glee with something happens in Israel. With regards to what happens in Lebanon and in all these places, they look in but this is nothing new to what is happening. They're always trying to pin some hope on something will happen to Israel, but they're not looking into their own very pitiful existence. I wouldn't trade anywhere with what happened in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. Everywhere the Iranians have touched, it's the anti-Midas touch. This is what the Iranians have. Everything they turn to garbage. So I don't think Israel has anything to do with it. Now, could we but we have to adjust. We have to look at what we do right now. And I do believe that China is here to stay, and we can't ignore it. We can't take the American look of looking at China as an absolute enemy and an absolute force for bad. It's here. We have to deal with it. We know we're dealing with Hamas. We had to deal with Lebanon. So we can deal with China on this issue. We can deal with Saudi Arabia. It might not be to the taste of all. I don't like it much, but I believe that there can be good come out of it. And regarding what Chuck said earlier, strategy is about looking at the situation as it is. There was no rapprochement between Israel and the entire Sunni states. They were not coming aboard into acting against Iran. This is our pie in the sky. Maybe that pie was closer than the Saudis one, but it was still a pie in the sky. We have to look at the way to narrow the pathway of Iran to a bomb. And if the Chinese on board is something that makes it a little harder on Iran to do so, that's better than the situation was a week ago, where no one was stepping in to do anything about what the Iranians are doing.
Chuck, your thoughts on the same?
Well, your question started with if one was looking at what's happening in Israel and Iran without any familiar with the region, would people think that the demonstrations are worse here or in Iran? Well, I mean, I think the answer is very clear, because if there is one regime that is in imminent danger of regime change in the future, in the near future in the Middle East, it's Israel, and it's not in Iran. Now, I say this with great pain. I'm glad that you pointed out before that I have an ability to look at things coldly. As a professional observer, I've tried to train myself over the years to separate myself from my feelings. And obviously, a lot of the things that we're talking about at the moment, I'd rather scream and shout about rather than talk in dispassionate terms. But yes, I think that the government in Israel, look, I mean, if the reforms go through as proposed, and I don't think they will completely, there will be, the coalition will back off to some extent. We are still in severe danger of becoming an illiberal democracy. The people say dictatorship are going too far. We're not going to become a dictatorship. But there is a realistic possibility of Israel becoming an illiberal democracy. That is something that I never, in my worst nightmares, thought that I could possibly say. At least for the immediate future, there's no threat to the Iranian regime. I don't know what's going to happen down the line. And it could and things could change there overnight at any point. That's the nature of authoritarian regimes. But yes, I believe this is a failure of Israeli policy. And I think it started with what was, to my way of thinking, and this is what a very significant part of the Israeli defense establishment believes. I believe also a majority of the defense establishment, but I won't open up that argument. That the withdrawal from the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a historic error. And I believe that the proof is in the pudding. Again, at the time, Iran was a year away from having enough fissile material for their first bomb, and today they have enough for 4 to 5 bombs, and they can have for 1 or 2 more in a matter of a couple of months. The possibility of normalization with the Saudis and other Sunni states has, again, at best been put off. Now, if I gave the impression that I thought that there was going to be a huge love fest between Israel and all of the Sunni states, that wasn't the case. But the fact is that the heir in Saudi Arabia, the future king, came out with a statement in 2018 recognizing Israel's right to exist in the region. That was a Sadat-like moment. That was a historic moment in the history of the region. And the Saudis, it seems, were progressing towards an open normalization with Israel. There certainly seems to be a lot of stuff happening both on the military and civilian levels beneath the surface. The UAE did embrace us openly and very warmly. The Bahrainis not quite as warmly, or not nearly, but they've been actually progressing nicely. The Moroccans relatively warmly. And had this continued, other states would have joined as well. There was a possibility, it's not completely gone, for a historic realignment. Now, the Syrians aren't going to join, the Iraqis aren't going to join, certainly at this point, the Libyans aren't going to join. But we have peace with 6 Arab countries today. And if the Saudis joined, the Arab-Israeli conflict would essentially be over. We'd be left, and not to belittle this exception, we'd be left with the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas.
And the Palestinian Arabs. Right, yeah, but they're not a military, they're a terrorist threat, they're not a military threat. All right.
You're right, but this is a huge change. We dreamt of this for decades, and it was within our grasp. The fact is that the Chinese brokered this agreement. There is a possibility for something good of it. If the Chinese, whose basic interest in the region is stability, is peace and quiet, put some pressure on the Iranians to at least slow things on the nuclear level, then that's a good outcome. But I don't share Yochai's overall optimism in that regard. I want the U.S. to lead things in the region. The U.S. is our foremost strategic ally. There is no comparison of the importance of the United States to Israel compared to any other country or superpower in the world. So I think this is a net loss for us. There's a danger that the Saudis will now turn to the Chinese for nuclear reactors, which the US hasn't been so willing to provide them. Let's wait and see what actually comes of all of this. But I certainly don't view this as a positive change for Israel. I think the question is just how bad the whole thing is.
So I'm going to ask one question of each of you, and just a very short answer from each of you, almost a couple of words if possible, just because of the time. Chuck, if this is a failure on Israel's part, at least in part, right? You clearly don't place all of the agency at Israel's door by any stretch. Of which government? Is it a failure of the Netanyahu government, the one that we have now, or is it a failure of the Bennett-Lapid government that preceded the current one?
Look, the Bennett-Lapid government was in office for a year and a half. And they did a couple of good things. I think mostly they didn't cause a lot of damage. I don't think that's the case of the Netanyahu governments. Bibi has been prime minister for most of the last 15 years. So with all due respect, he both bears credit for the good things that have happened during this period. For example, the Abraham Accords. For example, the fact that the Israeli economy was doing reasonably well. He gets a lot of credit for helping promote Israel's high-tech and cyber revolutions. He did some good things, but he also has to bear responsibility for the failures. And you asked for a short answer, so I'll just say his Iran policy, which was really his number one area of effort, has been to my way of thinking, colossal failure.
Yochai, the last question to you. You're an intelligence officer by training and expertise, so you can follow where the trail leads in various directions. We're seeing historic events here in Israel. We just hosted at the MirYam Institute. Chuck actually spoke to the group. We just hosted a delegation of active officers of the United States Army here on a strategy and policy tour. And we heard from generals, and we heard from the former head of Mossad, Yossi Cohen. We heard from Simcha Rothman, who's leading the charge on the judicial reform. And we heard from former defense ministers, Bogi Ya'alon, as an example. And they all said, this crisis that Israel's facing right now, this is no different to any other crisis, and we'll get through it. I don't agree with that. I'm not saying that Shakol Shachor, I'm not saying everything's black. It's not. But I was here during the crisis that took place prior to the disengagement from Gaza, and it didn't feel like this. It didn't feel like this. Where and when do you feel that this crisis is going to break, that the fever here is going to break? Do you think that we're going to see things get more difficult and see more strife here domestically with international ramifications, which I contest we are seeing at the moment? You disagree with me, but do you think it's going to continue for a while? Or do you think we're near a point where both sides realize we've got to sit down, sort out a compromise, and move beyond this because the tensions are just rising too high? And I'm sorry to press you on it, but a short answer.
It depends on what the government does. The ball is squarely in the hands of those with the power. So the question is whether reasonable mid-way reform is achieved. We'll see if this thing, but this is an all-encompassing issue. I'm not optimistic because what Israel is what is facing what we call a polycrisis. We're facing headwind from the economy, from inflation, from high interest rates, from what is happening with Iran, from the instability with the Palestinian arena. All of these, any one of these alone would have been a huge undertaking to anyone. We discussed Iran right now, but having all these come at conjoined is huge. And if we can't trust, and that's the issue here. In order to deal with these things, you have to trust each other. We have to be like brothers. And what is now happening is the breach of that trust. People don't look at each other. Families are torn apart in Israel. If we can't repair that trust, everything else will be far, far, far more difficult.
Well, I thank you both for giving of your insights here. I thank you both for your candor. I think that for better or worse, the days where an internal discussion in the state of Israel remained within the borders of the state of Israel due to social media and international media and the Internet of Things and so forth, those days have gone. And I think that our viewers and our listeners appreciate your candor. And I think that they're very clued up on what's going on over here at the moment. So thank you also for your expertise in addition to your candor. Thank you for allowing me to spar a little bit with both of you. Next time I'm going to get you to spar with each other more directly. I'll remove myself as umpire. And I always learn from you. I know that our guests have done the same. Just a couple of very quick points, corrections. Chuck, what's the title of your latest book? Did I announce it correctly at the beginning?
I think you did. Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. But
Perfect.
let me take, and it'll be out in June. Let me just take this opportunity to say one sentence, because you mentioned the fact that I had spoken at the group of visiting West Point officers that the MirYam Institute just brought to Israel. And I think that this is truly vital work that the Institute does. These are future leaders, American military leaders, and helping to mold their opinions at a earlier stage in their careers, like mid-level officers, is really a truly vital contribution, and I warmly commend the Institute for it, doing God's work.
Thank you. That means a great deal to me, and I know that Yochai has briefed them in the past and will do again, as you will again. Thank you. That's very, very humbling from someone such as you, Chuck. I appreciate that endorsement, and I want to also quickly acknowledge and thank Rosita Panini for drawing that together, the co-founder of the MirYam Institute. We will continue. We'll continue with our work, and whether you're listening to this on the podcast or watching this on JBS or watching it on our YouTube channel, thank you, each and every one of you. It's a heady subject, as I said at the top of the program, but it's one that certainly does warrant our time and our attention. And I still believe that we'll prevail, and I still believe that we will mend and heal these societal wounds that are unfortunately cropping up all over the place. But I think we can move beyond that as a people, and that would be my hope and my prayer. So with that, it's over and out from me and from everyone at the MirYam Institute. Thank you very much indeed again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.